Trigger warning. This story includes domestic betrayal and the endangerment of an infant. If that's difficult for you, please take care watching. They dragged me across my own marble floors and threw me into the snow, with my newborn in my arms. The cold hit like a verdict. My coat was spat across the stone like an accusation. Phones hovered over us, bright and hungry. They filmed every second. They laughed. Then they walked away and left us there, in the dark. If you love true revenge stories, subscribe for more. 3 days earlier, I woke to the sterile light of a hospital room with a band of tape across my belly and my daughter swaddled against my chest. They called her Luna because the night she arrived felt like a small, impossible miracle, a pale, quiet globe of breath and sleep. I sat on the edge of that hospital bed, every movement a small war, every breath an expensive, stolen thing. Brandon, my husband, kissed my forehead like he always had. He promised I was beautiful. He promised everything would be different now. I believed him because I wanted to. 2 hours later, I found his phone face up on the nightstand. The screen woke to a profile I didn't know. A woman, smiling, very pregnant, the caption full of coy emojis and promises of new beginnings. There was a photo of Brandon, hand at her waist. An hour passed like a thread being cut. I called him. He said it was nothing. I asked him to explain. He left the room and did not return for the rest of the day. The break in the world came when his mother, Helena, arrived with the kind of soft, practiced fury that belonged to aristocrats used to getting what they wanted. She walked into my recovery room like she owned the light. Gregory, the patriarch, watched from the doorway, his face a ledger of disappointment. Natasha, Brandon's sister, hovered at the edges like a vulture learning to be polite. They did not ask how I was. They did not ask about Luna. They showed me the phones instead. They told me the baby would ruin the family. They told me that I had been a secret all along, a mistake that Brandon could not afford to keep. They produced documents on the hospital table, an acknowledgement Brandon had signed weeks before the birth, a claim that his obligations to me would be handled quietly. I remember the way Helena's lips pressed. She spoke softly about reputation, bloodlines, and the public image a family maintained like a temple. I remember the room narrowing around me, like the iris of a camera closing on one tiny exposed thing. They pulled me from my bed and into the hallway of the hospital. They surrounded me with their phones and their voices. Natasha recorded as if it were theater. Someone called it closure. Maybe they thought it would be civil, a discreet divorce signed on a napkin in the corner of a waiting room. Instead, they brought a litany of accusations, lies about paternity, whispered stories about my past, assertions dressed up as concern. They produced a form. Sign this and we'll make it easier, Helena promised. Sign and the scandal will be contained. Under the weight of their pressure, with a new incision still tender, I signed. It was not a clear consent. It was signing while drowning. They whispered about legal counsel they had arranged. They offered me a cab, a small sum, and a smile like a blade. Brandon stood back, and for the first time I saw him as an actor in someone else's script, not my husband. He did not meet my eyes. They did not stop there. They drove me home, to the mansion I had only begun to imagine as ours. The front door stood like a threshold between the life I had and the one they wanted me to disappear into. I remember the chill of the marble under my bare feet, the same marble they later used to drag me across. They pushed me down the steps. Moonlight caught the baby carrier as it slid out of my hands. Someone's heel scuffed the edge of Luna's blanket. I felt my body fold like a book, and then a hard, cold sheet of snow rose to meet my face. They staged it as a performance. Helena's voice called after us. You were never one of us. They filmed it. Natasha posted. The video went up within minutes, edited to make me look hysterical, to make them look reasonable. The comments lit like a swarm. People called me cruel names. Friends I trusted messaged with clipped condolence and a question. Are you sure? The law, in their minds, could be bent when cameras and money worked hand in glove. Their narrative was simple. The inconvenient wife removed. Their narrative was rehearsed. They had done this before. The snow tasted of iron and shame. Breath fogged like lies. Luna cried, a small, urgent sound that tore through the white. For the first time, I understood that darkness can be a physical thing. The wide, white desert of a cold winter night where people you thought loved you choose to watch you almost die. We did not die, not because of them, because of strangers who arrived in the most unlikely way. A black van without emblems pulled up behind a hedge as if arriving from nowhere. A woman leaned into the driver's window and spoke in a low voice. They wrapped Luna and me in another blanket and carried us, not with the gentle hands of family, but with an industry of care so precise it felt like choreography. I later learned they were representatives of my grandfather. They called themselves guardians, though for all I knew, they were angels in suits. At the private hospital where they took us, a man in an old-fashioned suit with careful eyes introduced himself as Mr. Harrison. He spoke in the quiet authority lawyers develop when they have seen everything and still choose not to be surprised. He had a folder. He did not mince words. My name is William Harrison, he said. I represent William Chen. He left you everything. It should have been impossible. My grandfather had been a man who collected empires like a child collects shells. Chen Global was the thing the family whispered about at holiday tables, the invisible architecture behind buildings, shipping lines, factories. I knew him, but I did not think like an heiress. I thought like someone living one step from a hospital bed. Mr. Harrison opened the folder. There it was, a will, recent and precise, witnessed and notarized. It named me, Min Lin, sole beneficiary of William Chen's holdings in full, not a sliver, but the whole estate, property, holdings, enterprises. A figure between the lines of the documents that made my head swim when it was finally translated into numbers, roughly $2.3 billion. The estate plan had been reorganized in the months before my grandfather died. It was intentional and it was direct. No trusts funneling it into the Kingston family, no contingencies for Helena's concerns. My name sat on that page like a detonator. I remember thinking two things at once. The cold had not left my bones, and none of this was going to be easy. What followed was not sudden wealth handed over like a cake. It was legal scaffolding, trustees, executors, audits. Chen Global could not simply flip a switch and transfer billions into my account. That's not how law or money works. But Mr. Harrison had more than a folder. He had an outline, a map. He had, crucially, evidence that the Kingstons had been preparing to manufacture claims against me. They had forged documents. They had attempted to section off certain assets through backdated contracts and unsigned agreements. They had courted partners and loans with the expectation of absorbing parts of Chen Global if they could force a settlement or a diversion. In short, they were ready to lie, to take. "You're not just an heir," Mr. Harrison said. "You're leverage." Leverage. The word arrived like a seed. It was not vengeance. It was a mechanism. If money is power and power is structure, then a change in ownership could collapse the lies built on top of the Kingston family like scaffolding that loses a foundation. They were deeply leveraged themselves, high-interest loans, hidden obligations, and a reliance on contracts that routed through Chen Global's network. Their exposure was real and, once known, exploitable in the ways the law allows for recovery and justice. That night, the night I had been left like refuse in a driveway, I slept, for the first time since the hospital hallway, that I had something they did not understand, the permission to fight back in the structure of law and finance. Rage still simmered beneath the skin, but now it had a legal vocabulary. The transformation did not happen with a montage set to triumphant music. It happened in meetings that began at 8 in the morning and ended at 2 in the morning, and in 1,000 small things that add up to change. I learned how to read balance sheets with a mixture of panic and cruel delight. I learned about debt instruments and how creditors sell what's owed to them on secondary markets. I learned that buying distressed debt, loans someone else holds, can give you the right to call those loans due, to push a company into negotiations, to sit across from them at the table and say, calmly, pay me or we take control. Mr. Harrison brought in people, an investigator who smelled of coffee in old cases, a young, relentless forensic accountant who preferred data to drama, a PR strategist who had handled scandals that left reputations in pieces, and a courtroom lawyer who spoke in terms that did not allow for moralizing, only pushing. We built a small army, legal minds, financial operators, private investigators, and women who had themselves been pushed out and were looking for a way forward. I watched each of them work and felt myself change, from bleeding person to strategist, from victim to executive, in the act of learning to wield the very tools that could dismantle a family who had tried to erase me. We started small and plausible. We enforced the will. We sought court recognition of the executor and the estate plan. The Kingstons had crafted a narrative using forged documents and a chorus of familiar voices. Our first move was to discredit that chorus. We hired a lab to attest to the authenticity of signatures and the chain of custody of documents. We found inconsistencies in the Kingston contracts, dates that could not coexist with invoices, handwriting that matched a known forger samples in the family's past, phone metadata that located key actors at the places they later denied being. Each finding was a thread. We did not pull some of them at once because the art of this kind of legal pressure is not to expose everything too early. It is to expose exactly what is needed to move the opponent into a position where they must either pay, fold, or be destroyed by their own fabrications. We started small and plausible. We enforced the will. We sought court recognition of the executor and the estate plan. The Kingstons had crafted a narrative using forged documents and a chorus of familiar voices. Our first move was to discredit that chorus. We hired a lab to attest to the authenticity of signatures and the chain of custody of documents. We found inconsistencies in the Kingston contracts, dates that could not coexist with invoices, handwriting that matched a known forger samples in the family's past, phone metadata that located key actors at the places they later denied being. Each finding was a thread. We did not pull some of them at once because the art of this kind of legal pressure is not to expose everything too early. It is to expose exactly what is needed to move the opponent into a position where they must either pay, fold, or be destroyed by their own fabrications. Parallel to the legal work, we moved in the financial sphere. We reached out to creditors who were already nervous. Kingston Industries had taken loans against long-term supply contracts that implicitly relied on Chen Global's supplier guarantees. When those guarantees shifted, so did the calculus. We quietly offered to purchase some of Kingston's most vulnerable loans. Buying debt is simple in principle. Creditors who are tired of chasing a company for payments will sell that right for a fraction of what's owed. You pay cash, you acquire a legal right, and, crucially, you become the one who can make demands. We did it discreetly and with full counsel. We did not call anyone at night to threaten. We followed the law, hired proper intermediaries, and made offers creditors took because their options were bleak. Within weeks, the composition of Kingston's creditors had changed enough that we could legally trigger steps when certain covenants were violated. A covenant is simply a promise in a contract. When it's broken, the lender can accelerate the debt, demand immediate repayment, or negotiate for control of assets. We armed ourselves with the ability to accelerate. At the same time, our investigators found Cassandra, or as everyone would soon know her, Candy Thompson, the woman who had managed the narrative, the con who had woven through our lives like a thread left to strangle. She had a history, staged photos, false identities, small cons that escalated into something much darker when she was given access to a wealthy household. We found bank transfers that matched the times she moved between properties, communications that suggested coordination with Natasha to create scenes that could be broadcast. But evidence for criminal charges requires more than reasonable suspicion. It requires proof. We compiled what we could, and we gave it to prosecutors who were finally willing to look. Then came PR. We did not leak, as in mean it as a dirty word. We retained an ethical journalist who specializes in financial crimes and allowed them to investigate under a condition of corroboration. The story was published with receipts attached, redacted documents, photographic evidence of the staged mansion scenes, and interviews with former collaborators of Cassandra who wanted out of the lie. The article did what any well-documented piece does. It reframed the conversation. Suddenly, the people who had applauded our humiliation were wondering about the narrative they'd been fed. The social media tide turned because credible reporters presented facts, not fury. As our legal pressure mounted and the press began to ask the right questions, Kingston Industries found its creditors uneasy. When a major lender gets the sense that loans are at risk, especially if contractual guarantees have just been called into question, they make the prudent choice of cutting exposure. That is when offers come to the table, either recapitalize or let the lender take control. We were ready to buy. You have to understand what buying debt looks like in practice. We bought portions of loans from 3 different institutional creditors who wanted immediate liquidity. We hired reputable firms to manage the transactions. We transferred funds through standard channels. It was not dramatic. It was tedious and legal. Yet with those transactions, the ability to influence Kingston's board and financial decisions shifted. We had legal standing to sit down with them and say, "We control a significant portion of your debt. Here are our terms." It is an unromantic weapon, documents, signatures, a bank transfer. But in that moment, it is more lethal than anything physical because it can remove the roof from a family and expose everything they tried to hide. There were nights I would not sleep. There were mornings I would. The anger that had hollowed me out became a machine of focus. People around me were learning not to ask whether I would seek revenge, but how I planned to do it precisely, within the boundaries of law. That was my promise to myself. I would not become like them. I would not break the law. I would dismantle them through the systems that gave them power. The crescendo, the boardroom where everything would be made public, was not an improvisation. We rehearsed legal responses. We ensured that subpoenas were in place, and we confirmed that criminal referrals were ready to be handed to prosecutors. We timed our moves so that when we made a demand in a public setting, we could immediately back it with legal force, an injunction to freeze assets, a filing for fraud, or a notice of default that would cascade through Kingston's financing structure. On the day of the confrontation, I took a breath and thought about the snow. I thought about the weight of the phone cameras in the hospital hallway. I thought of Luna's small, urgent cry cutting through everything. I let those images harden into the calm I needed. The boardroom was a glass box that looked out over a city that had no idea what would happen inside. Kingston's directors sat around the table like a small nation. Helena's hands were folded. Gregory stared as if finishing a play. Natasha attempted a smile that did not reach her eyes. Cassandra, who had been playing a part of a charming consultant in their narrative, sat like someone waiting for a cue. I walked in and sat at the head of the table. The room registered the gesture like a temperature change. I did not tremble. My voice was not loud. I used the same voice I had used to sign 1,000 checks, to argue with accountants, to read a courtroom filing at 3 in the morning. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, "you filmed a mother and her newborn and left them dead in a driveway. You published and celebrated that moment. Today I will show you what the light looks like when it's trained on the truth." I signaled. They dimmed the lights. A screen flickered to life. The first clip was raw and short. The hospital hallway, phones recording, Natasha's voice narrating as if the cameras were a Greek chorus. The footage was unedited and brutal in its clarity. The second clip was the mansion steps. The carrier slid. A foot caught a blanket. The audio captured laughter, the exact timbre of Helena's "You were never one of us." The third clip was something they had not intended anyone to see. The inside of Cassandra's car, messages coordinating the place and the angle of the video, a transfer of funds right after the performance to a shell account. We had obtained those materials through legal means, search warrants, subpoenas served in appropriate forums, and testimony from actors who had been paid to play extras in the staged scene and had decided to cooperate. For the first time in public, their own images told a story that contradicted their narrative. The room did not explode. It disintegrated with the slow, terrifying logic of a watch that finally succumbs to water. I did not scream. I spoke in small sentences, precise and sharp. I explained that the will was genuine, that the trustees had revoked certain authorizations the Kingstons had tried to claim, and that the debt we had purchased gave us leverage to demand accountability. I described how we had found the forged contracts, the timelines that betrayed two different versions of events, and the financial links that showed Kingston's exposure. When I played the final clip, Cassandra on a private line admitting to staging scenes in exchange for payments, the room shifted. Helena's hands went white, Natasha's cheeks flushed. Cassandra's face was the face of someone who had been unmasked, and who knew the law now mattered more than her charm. Our legal team had already filed papers. We had a civil suit ready, a filing that sought damages and the recovery of assets moved under false pretenses. We had a criminal referral detailing fraud and conspiracy. We had creditors notified. We had a court order ready to freeze certain accounts the moment a judge could consider it. This was not theater. It was the application of law to the facts we had gathered. Then, with a calm I had learned because there was no room for melodrama, I made our offer. "Resign your positions from any company that stands to profit off this," I said. "Return the funds that were covertly transferred. Cooperate with the investigators and the authorities, or we proceed." There was a quiet argument, like a chess game where the pawns realize their player has been swapped mid-match. Some of Kingston's board sought to negotiate. Some left the room. Within a week, a major creditor declared a default. Within 2, Kingston Industries announced a restructuring under the pressure of called loans and the certainty of a deepening scandal. Cassandra was arrested. The charges were for fraud and for orchestrating schemes that had created false documentation and false narratives with malicious intent. The evidence we provided, transfers, messages, and witness testimony, was sufficient for the prosecutor to take action. She was charged, arraigned, and her charismatic smile on the stand did not save her. Watching the footage of her arrest one night, I felt no joy. I felt only the clean sensation of the world returning to a logical outcome. Liar gets consequences, not applause. The fallout for the Kingstons was not poetic justice served in a single act. It was a slow, bureaucratic unraveling of contracts called due, of reputational damage that made partners nervous, of companies falling into receivership because the risk the lenders had accepted suddenly bloomed into a real legal threat. They declared bankruptcy in parts. Trustees took over certain assets. Helena lost the ability to control the charity she had used as staging grounds for influence. Gregory retreated into silence. Natasha, who had posted the video that started it all, found herself summoned to testify about communications she had tried to keep private. Through it all, my focus remained on one thing, Luna. I had entered this fight because someone had tried to erase her from a life she deserved. When the dust settled enough for me to step back into sunlight, I signed the final paperwork to create a foundation in my daughter's name, a shelter and resource center for women who had been pushed out for inconvenient pregnancies, for mothers who were trying to survive the twin storms of shame and financial ruin. Money, I had learned, can be a tool to build safety nets instead of cages. People ask me now if the revenge felt sweet. The truth is more complicated. The sweetest thing was not watching them fall. The sweetest thing was reclaiming dignity and making it durable for other people. The worst part was reliving the humiliation in courtrooms and depositions, sealing memory in affidavits, dragging truth into public forums where it could be examined by strangers and possibly misinterpreted. There was no gloating in the victory, only a steady and quiet reshaping of my life. There are myths about stories like mine, about miraculous instantaneous transfers, about heroes who learned 15 years of corporate law in one weekend. None of that is true. It was work. It was the accumulation of legal filings, the slow purchase of debt instruments, the meticulous building of a case from small, verifiable facts. It required patience and the willingness to be mundane and precise, signing papers, sitting in windowless rooms with accountants, learning to read a loan covenant and understand what it obliges someone to do. Power doesn't come from a single moment of righteous fury. It comes from the grind of strategy applied consistently. When people ask what my grandfather would think of all this, of his billions and the way they became a lever for justice, I admit I don't know. I want to believe he would have approved that his name now funds safety for women and clinics for new mothers who had no one to hold them when the world turned cold. I hope he would be proud that his resources did not become another tool for family pretension, but a lifeline. There are also softer victories. Luna learned early to laugh. She blinked against windows and watched birds. I took her to a playground where I felt for a long while like a woman who had been repaired. People ask how I sleep. I sleep now because fear has been replaced by responsibility. I am not immune to the past, of course. On certain mornings, the smell of hospital disinfectant brings the memory of that corridor back. On certain nights, the internet surfaces parts of the video and I breathe through it. But the presence of work, the presence of purpose steadies me more than revenge ever could. There are also softer victories. Luna learned early to laugh. She blinked against windows and watched birds. I took her to a playground where I felt for a long while like a woman who had been repaired. People ask how I sleep. I sleep now because fear has been replaced by responsibility. I am not immune to the past, of course. On certain mornings, the smell of hospital disinfectant brings the memory of that corridor back. On certain nights, the internet surfaces parts of the video and I breathe through it. But the presence of work, the presence of purpose steadies me more than revenge ever could. The aftermath rippled publicly. News outlets covered the legal filings, then the arrest, then the restructuring. My name appeared in headlines with adjectives I had never expected: heiress, activist, chairwoman. I accepted an interim position on Chen Global's board because I believe in stewardship. My first act was to audit the channels that allowed people like Cassandra to exploit access under the guise of consultancy. My second was to allocate funds for legal aid to women in crises. And the third was to institutionalize a process in Chen Global to prevent the same kind of reputational and ethical rot that had allowed the Kingston family to behave as they did. I will tell you what I learned, not as instruction, but as a map of what it took for one woman to stand when others tried to press her into the darkness. First, keep documents. Keep receipts. Keep copies. Memory is thin. Paper and now secure digital backups is not. Many of the lies against me relied on the absence of accessible evidence. We filled those gaps with forensic timestamps, metadata, and witnesses. Second, build a team. I could not have done this alone. I needed lawyers who understood estate law and creditors' rights, accountants who could read between balance sheets, investigators who could find money trails, and PR professionals who would not sensationalize pain. They were professionals. They did not promise vindication. They promised facts. Third, use legal and financial channels, not violence. The law slows the pursuit of revenge into something deliberate and accountable. It gives you options that result in structural remedies instead of vigilantism. That might make headlines less juicy, but it makes justice sustainable. Fourth, transform resources into systems. My grandfather's money could have been a private vanishing point for wealth and secrets. Instead, I created institutions that outlast a single story: a foundation, clinics, legal aid. That matters because vindication itself is fleeting if it does not create a better world. I am not trying to moralize. I am trying to tell the truth about what happened. Left in darkness by people who claim to be family, I found a path by understanding that leverage exists everywhere. In the law, in contracts, in the quiet folding of a will. I did not become the monster of their stories. I became someone who refused to be removed from the narrative of my life. People sometimes ask if I feel sympathy for the Kingstons. The answer is complicated. I feel pity for the ways power can corrupt people into small cruelties. I feel no desire to revel in their ruin. They made choices and the system responded. That is not a moral victory exactly. It's a factual one. Systems respond to evidence. When you expose a lie, the structure built on that lie collapses, and that collapse affects more people than those who deserve it. As for Cassandra, she is serving a sentence proportionate to the offenses she was convicted of, and she has no control over my life anymore than I have over the consequences that used to be her livelihood. The legal system did its work. That is all I wanted: truth acknowledged and harm reduced. Sometimes people frame stories like this as revenge, but I prefer to call it reclamation. Reclaiming my name, reclaiming my daughter's right to be safe, reclaiming dignity under law. The best revenge, I discovered, is not to ruin others for catharsis. It is to build a life that cannot be erased by them. If this story resonates with you, if you felt that tilt of anger or the rise of something like hope, I would ask you to do one small thing: like and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being pushed into darkness does not have to be the final chapter. And tell me in the comments, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? There are nights I still look out at the city and think about the marble and the snow. But when I think of those moments now, I picture something else. A room full of women in my foundation, babies bundled and warm, lawyers pro bono, and a small office where a team teaches women how contracts work, because knowledge is a kind of light. They left me in darkness. Then the light came. It wasn't miraculous. It was precise, legal, and relentless. It was built by people who refused to let a newborn be erased by someone else's script. In the end, the shocking truth about my billion-dollar inheritance was not simply that someone had left me money. It was that when you are given resources, you can choose to protect not only yourself, but others who stand where you once stood, small, vulnerable, and left in the cold. We reclaimed the dignity stolen from us. We did it without bloodshed, without law-breaking, and without becoming the sort of people who would celebrate cruelty. That might not be the most dramatic version of victory, but it is the one that lasts. What would you have done if you were me? Tell me below. And if this story moved you, share it. Maybe it will give someone else the courage to find light in a place they thought was only dark.